Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Out of the Fishbowl. My name is BrettFish, and this is episode 5 of season 2 already. And let's jump straight in because today we are going to be speaking about peace. And I'm hoping that this is going to be a definition and an idea of peace that is bigger than the one that you currently have. So, as a child in church, we used to sing a song that went, "I've got peace like a river." And the imagery that conjures up is a gentle flowing stream. I'm the river, look at me, everything is gentle and calm and peaceful in the river. Whereas in reality, a river can be all of that, but it can also be relentless over time, carving its way through stone and sand and more, simply by its continuing presence. Now, today's quote is a little bit longer than normal and comes from the Book of Common Prayer by Shane Claiborne, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, and Enuma Okoro. And it says this: peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice, the act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer, the act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and oppressors free. Wow. Imagine a peace that works to set the oppressed and the oppressor free. Which is why, although sometimes it can be experienced as a river, sometimes gentle, other times powerful and persistent, refusing to give, I also like to imagine peace as a tiny piece of metal that can hold two much larger pieces of metal in place, an idea and an action that, when intentionally pursued, can transform the course of a broken and traumatic history, like a rivet, which is why I've decided to name this episode
Episode 5 Peace Like a Rivet.
Peace Like a River. I grew up thinking that peace was the absence of something, the absence of fighting or war or conflict. But the more I think about it and engage with it, the more I'm starting to believe that alongside that idea, it is also more specifically the presence of something or some things. And a thought to consider with all this are the dual ideas of peacekeeping versus peacemaking. The one assumes that peace has already been achieved, peacekeeping, while the other speaks to an absence of a desired peace. And so peace has to be made in some way. And even as I wrote this or planned this or thought about this, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the term peacemaking, which sounds a little bit kind of like superhero swoop in and bring the peace. And so I'm wondering if there might be a third way, peace facilitating, where everyone is involved in the process rather than being the recipients of. How do we collectively create this peace together? And this might be a good time to do a quick segue to one of the most powerful yet underutilized or acknowledged ideas that I've come to appreciate more and more in the past few years. This notion of both and as opposed to either or. And so you get many circumstances where people, especially in social media, like to break things down to either or. It's black and white. And we see this especially in matters of black and white. It's either this or it's that. Whereas it can be mind blowing to take a moment and realize that two different things can be true at the same time. So in South Africa, people might be saying something against the DA, one of the parties, and people go, no, but what about the ANC, the ruling party? They're problematic. They're full of corruption. They are mismanaging resources and all of this. And it's like, yes, the ANC can be problematic and the DA can be problematic. Two parties can be problematic at the same time. In America, you see this with the Republicans versus the Democrats. It's not that one side is completely right in all things and the other side is completely wrong in all things. There are things that are good and things that are bad in both sides. It's like taking something like anti-racism and saying you've got to put all your focus there. And somebody else will say, what about anti-violence to women? As if we've got to choose. We've got to choose anti-racism or we've got to choose anti-violence to women. And sometimes it's both and. I can spend my life being aware of how my actions, thoughts, and words can be racist or problematic to Black, colored, and Indian people. And I can at the same time see how my words and actions and attitudes and behavior can be violent and harmful to women. And so, me realizing that I need to work on both of those at the same time, it's a both and, it's not either or. I don't just work on my racism, I don't just work on my problematic areas towards women. I realize both of those are areas where I struggle, where I need to learn, where I need to listen, where there's work to be done. And it can be mind blowing to some people to hold two ideas that aren't conflicting, but can sometimes feel like they force us to choose. And often we don't have to pick sides. Both and, as opposed to either or. And so this brings us to this idea of intersectionality. And a lot of people find that word difficult or confusing or problematic. But when I look at the essence of it, it's that things intersect. There's an intersecting and overlapping of things, that sometimes things happen in the same place. And so this idea of anti-racism and violence towards women existing in the same place. And so when you start to speak about intersectionality, you have an idea where you might have a black man who is problematic towards women. And so there's issues of race there, but there's also issues of violence towards women there. And then you might have a white woman who is being racist to a black man. And so again, like where in that conversation, where in that thing happening, is it a violence towards women aspect, a patriarchy thing? Where is it a race thing? And so sometimes the intersectionality makes these things really complicated and confusing. And that's why we've got to approach these things with nuance, with empathy, with deep listening, because they are really as simple as you can make out in a single tweet or in a status update. These things are complex and nuanced, and they involve people and context and feeling and history and all these kind of things. Intersectionality plays a role. People's background, people's color, people's race, gender, religion, all of those things often intersect. And sometimes when there's an issue at hand, you've got to sit there and you've got to kind of peel away the different layers to find out what's really going on. And so when we speak about peace, it's this idea that it's both an absence of and it's a presence of. It's a both and, it's not one or the other. And so we've got to look a bit deeper at both of them. But let's head back to this idea of a river. Probably 15 years ago now, I embarked on one of the greatest road trips of my life so far, when my mate Justin and I drove to the Niagara Falls for one night. And if there was a key learning from that adventure, it would be don't ever go to the Niagara Falls for just one night. What was wrong with us? I think it had to do with timing. I forget what state we went from, but it was a long, long road trip there. And we only had enough time to literally go in, spend the night, and leave. But it still stands as one of my top nature experiences, although the Grand Canyon and my birthday scuba dive give it good competition. And then the fact of living just under Table Mountain, there's some good competition, both and, right? We don't have to choose. But mostly I was blown away by the water, which is not something I would ever imagine finding myself say. I tend to be more an indoors person than an outdoors person. I'm board games and books and series and things like that. And so the idea of standing next to this near deafening, rampaging torrent of water, just relentlessly pounding the rocks below over and over again, did not have me humming Peace Like a River. And yet at the same time, strangely, the consistency of it and the absolute power behind it strongly suggested a special kind of peace. Not the absence of, but rather the presence of. And maybe that's something for us to think through a little more deeply. Standing there with this water that was just fully in control and just kind of reduced me to this little pipsqueak on the side, this little nothing creature. The water was in control, but there was a sense of the presence of something there that I could just stand in awe at and wonder. And this really starts to point me in the direction of the Hebrew idea of shalom. Now, please hear me on this one. I am not an expert on shalom, on the understanding of it. And so please go do some extra work. Go and read up and research and listen to people that are experts, because just the bit that I've heard and then a little bit of extra that I found when I was researching a little bit to be able to speak about this, of this idea of shalom, is just so beautiful and enticing and incredible. And so what I'm going to share with you now are just some things I read in my research, but the idea and the meaning of shalom, peace, is something worth taking more time on. So go and do that. Now, apparently, the root word of shalom is shalom, which can be translated as make it good, shall surely pay, make full restitution, or to restore. The ancient Hebrew meaning of shalom was to make something whole, not just regarding practical restoration of things that were lost or stolen, but with an overall sense of fullness and completeness in mind, body, and estate. Everything is well again. Shalom. And so, although it can describe an absence of war, it often is used to speak to completeness and tranquility, a sense of wholeness of being. And Rabbi Robert I. Kahn capsulizes the distinctiveness of Roman peace and Hebrew shalom when he says this: one can dictate a peace, shalom is a mutual agreement. Peace is a temporary pact, shalom is a permanent agreement. One can make a peace treaty, shalom is the condition of peace. Peace can be negative, the absence of commotion. Shalom is positive, the presence of serenity. Peace can be partial, shalom is whole. Peace can be piecemeal, shalom is complete. And in post-Talmudic Jewish thought, Isaac Arama paraphrased the idea of God being peace by saying this: peace is a positive thing, the essential means by which men of differing temperaments and opinions can work together for the common good. Pearls of individual virtue would be dim in isolation were it not for the string of peace that binds them together and so increases their luster. That is why peace is a name of God, for it is God who gives unity to the whole of creation. Which brings me to my country, South Africa. And if you're listening to this in another country, this may likely apply there as well. But South Africa is not known as a peaceful country. Peace is definitely something that there's a large absence of. And so when it comes to peace, we will not likely speak so much of peacekeeping as we will of peacemaking. And even as I say that term again, it sounds wrong somehow, as if we could just head into a laboratory and throw some stuff together and make some peace. Peace building sounds a little closer to what we are looking for. Or else a particularly clunky term that jumped into my mind, but which is rich in meaning, is peace co-creating. I don't think an individual can ever be solely responsible for bringing peace. It has to happen in community, together. And maybe it's less about bringing or creating the thing, peace, as it is about working together to cultivate a space or context in which peace can start to take root and grow or flourish. But actually, and my thinking on this is being shaped as I write, as I reflect, as I plan, even as I speak this, and hopefully it is for you as you're listening. I do think that peacekeeping part is relevant, even in this context. When I chatted to my birthday twin and good friend Maklatsi a while ago about this, he reminded me of the importance of both of these aspects happening at the same time, the making and the keeping. But I'm also reminded of another simple but amazing concept I was introduced to in the Bible, where Jesus sends out the disciples and he says, when you go to a new village, find a man or a person of peace. This idea of a person of peace, peacekeeping. And so when we're looking for peace, go to spaces where it's already happening. Learn from people that are already doing it and grow into what it is together. And so this idea, this concept of a person of peace, and maybe as you're thinking of the spaces you inhabit, maybe it's the office, maybe it's your sports team, maybe it's your community, maybe somebody comes to mind as a person of peace. Who is somebody that everyone looks to for wisdom or for hospitality, or somebody that always steps in to bring peace? And when we're starting to look for peace around us, aligning ourselves with a person of peace or people of peace is a really good way to start. Now, as I started to think about this idea of the man or woman of peace, the names and faces of a whole lot of people just sprang to mind. And I literally wrote down a list of more than 20 people that came without even having to think about it. There are some just amazing quality people in and around my life that are people of peace. And it might be interesting to note that not too many of them are politicians, because when it comes to keeping or bringing the peace, then we might naturally start by thinking, well, surely that's the government's job. And yet in South Africa, where I live, and it might be the same where you are, I think most of us gave up expecting peace to come from the government. With all the corruption and just plain bad or non existent leadership a lot of the time, with a few exceptions. No, peace is more likely to be found on the ground, in individuals committed to being and making the change, in NGOs and faith communities who just get on with it and do the work of introducing or upholding peace in various forms. And so I decided to invite some of the people behind the names that come to mind when I think of peacemaking or peacekeeping to share a thought or two on peace. And here are what some of them had to say about it.
My name is Mahlatsi Mashua.
I'm Hani Tutoy.
Andre Flock here.
Mary speaking.
Hi, my name is John.
My name is Megan.
I'm Renee.
Hi, my name is Sean.
This is Mzwandile Nguta.
In the weirdest kind of way, I think peace has to do with tolerance. And I actually think that peace is an emotion. And I think that peace has to do with deep, deep acceptance. And it's about accepting. And that's why I think it's to do with tolerance.
What is peace? I suppose it's a bit like love. Hard to define, but you'll know it when you see it. To me, peace is a process. It's a gift. It is something that only exists when we create it, when we bring it into the world. It is freedom from oppression. It's a friend in the storm. It is something that we have a responsibility to create and to share with those around us. So peace is not a sentimental, soft concept. Peace is work. Peace is hard work. Peace is our joy when we have it and when we share it. It is something that we all need to work at harder for ourselves and for others.
Just to say that when I think of peace, I think of a very well-known painting that I've seen on occasions. I'm afraid I don't know who the artist is, but it depicts peace beautifully. It's a picture of a cliffside at the beach, and a storm is raging with thunder, lightning, grey, heavy skies, wind howling, and the waves pounding onto the rocks and onto the beach. And as you look closely at the picture, you see, amidst all the storm, in the side of the cliff is a hollowed out rock, and in that little hollow there is sitting a dove, peaceful, calm, not perturbed at all by the disturbance around. And that's my picture of peace.
When I think of peace, for me as a human, there's two responses. The one is internally for myself. I think we as humans should seek to be able to be at peace within ourselves in any kind of circumstance. And I think that's something we have to learn. And I think that, so when it comes to the individual themselves, peace is something we pursue internally. But because we are inextricably members of society, as humans, our job is to seek peace for others as well. And that's often an external journey. That is often, what's necessary for that is to often break down systems and struggle against systems that cause people not to be at peace. I think simply demanding that people who are constantly in systems that don't create peace only find peace internally, I think is trying to dodge the real issue. Because as humans, our job isn't just to seek something for ourselves, but to seek peace for others as well.
When I think about peace, I think it is describing a state of being. And I've always been enamored by the concept as describing a state of being where nothing is missing, nothing is broken, everything functioning as it's intended to, whether it's within individuals themselves. So, for instance, their identities, that there's a harmony between identities as it should be, or between groups of people or within communities. I experience this concept as a mediator a lot, where we are working towards the state that is described. And so it's a journey, peace building or peace making. And therefore there's a negative aspect of it where the definition of peace, that is where we talk about ceasing hostilities, we talk about removing violence, all which builds to then the positive definition, which is co-creating an environment where there is a thriving of everyone who is involved within the community, or as groups of people for that matter. And so there's a positive definition that leads therefore to then the ultimate state of being. And it's difficult to think about the concept of peace, or to define it, for me at least, without invoking God, because central to the definition is you're working towards a definition that says as things are intended to be. And so the question is, who intends them to be that way? And certainly as an objective measure, if you're talking about creation, or between creatures, or between created things, then it's God who's the source, the sustainer of life, and the goal of all reality outside of himself. And based on that definition, he's the one who then determines what the intended state that leads to thriving should be.
Peacekeeping often involves silencing, repressing and suppressing what needs to be said, apparently with the intention of avoiding division or even violence. However, peacekeeping does not resolve or heal anything. The wounds, the hurts, and often the injustice that has disrupted peace persists. On the other hand, peacemaking involves actively engaging each other, acknowledging the source of our difference. It involves the courage to speak truth to power and to listen intently to each other's needs. Peacemaking is deeply uncomfortable because it means being vulnerable. It calls power dynamics into question, and it requires a commitment bigger than ourselves. And so therefore, in my view, peacemaking is a radically courageous act of compassion and humanity.
Peace can mean many things to many people. I wonder what your imagination conjures up when you hear the word peace. Is it tranquility? Is it the kind of quiet that you find in a graveyard where all is dead and nothing stirs and nothing disturbs? Or is it the kind of peace that you find in a maternity ward that is bursting with life? And at the same time, you hear screams of delight and screams of anguish. In the presence of that kind of peace, you get those who bear witness to the things that bring life and the things that threaten life. It's also being postured precariously, where we notice fragility and we can appreciate the accompaniment of others together with all those who create the capacity for life to thrive. When I think about peace in the world, I'm not thinking of countries where nothing is happening. I'm thinking of the ability to make choices that can produce dynamic love and dynamic goodness for all of creation, not just for me and my friends, and certainly not just for those who I prioritize, but for all people. When I think of peacekeeping, I think of the activity of the United Nations, for example, in the midst of the Rwandan genocide, where they considered themselves a presence of peace, but didn't lift a finger to prevent anyone's death. When I think of peace building, I think of that ongoing preemptive peace that not only mitigates against the things that drive conflict, but the kinds of things that build capacity for love, and the kinds of intentions that seek to include all those who stand to gain and stand to lose when there is peace. It's certainly those who benefit from war, who enact work that makes them enemies of peace. And so what makes us co-conspirators for love, for preemptive transformation? Who are the actors that we consider architects of peace that we want to collaborate with? That is the work of peace building.
As I respond to the idea of peacekeeping, one of the first things that pops into my mind is how almost impossible peacekeeping is. I'm probably becoming a pacifist, but I grew up in a theological environment that didn't support pacifism, but I have a very deep passion, I don't know if that's the right word, for people in the police services and in the military who are often called on to be peacekeepers, and how impossible that job is in the kind of world we live in, and what a massive personal toll it often takes on them, and how they are often thrown away by society once a war is over or the political powers that they serve have achieved whatever goal they want to achieve. I think peacekeeping is unsustainable. I believe that peacemaking is sustainable. Both of those things demand massive sacrifices from those who are seeking to achieve them.
Oftentimes when we think of peace, we can think of the absence of something, the absence of anxiety, the absence of war, the absence of chaos and confusion. We can think of the absence of humans. Something peaceful might be a quiet, serene place next to a waterfall under a tree with no humans. But the ancient tradition of peace is much richer and deeper than that. It has to do with flourishing in all of our dimensions, our spiritual dimensions, our social dimensions, our physical, political, our environmental dimensions. And that was the view of the Jewish people. The Jewish people had this word shalom, which means to be in right relationship with God, with others, with creation, and even with one's self. And the early Christians built on that and said that God is the God who is the maker of shalom, the bringer of flourishing, the one who seeks to restore things to the way that they're supposed to be. So when I think of peace, I don't just think of the absence of something. I think of creating something, flourishing in all dimensions of our existence.
For me, peace is a contested notion because it is an invitation to explore, practice, and imagine God's peaceable world. In other words, God's shalom here on earth as it is in heaven. But yet, at the same time, our yearning and pursuing peace can also be colored by practices of violence. So for me, peace is an impossible possibility. This idea of impossible possibility can be found or is embodied in the words of Prophet Jeremiah. Chapter 6, verse 14, where he says, "They treat the wound of my people as if it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." In reflecting on those words, peace can be seen as something that is being pursued, but it can also be an impossibility. Jesus, again in Ephesians chapter 4, reflects on how these divisions and disparities that divides people's groups, Jesus enters as or symbolizes peace by breaking down the walls of hostility. The other aspect of peace being an impossible possibility is precisely in reflecting about peace as a hospitable gesture. That both words hospitality and hostility derive from the same root meaning. That it is very simple, it is quite easy to practice hospitality while at the same time creating hostile practices. So peace is always coupled with this complex practice, that in our yearning for peace, we might also at the same time create violent or hostile practices. So for me, peace is an impossible possibility. Yes, it can be grounded because of God's vision of shalom, but yet at the same time, it can create a precarious space for possibilizing violence, hostility, and oppression.
But I really do believe that peace starts with me, both internally and behaviorally, but then also in the places and spaces that I find myself and in the communities of people that I engage with. I think peacemaking has two sides to it. When I think of something like racism and the anti-racist work I need to be doing, then the one really important aspect of peacemaking is a sort of a negative aspect which involves being against the absence of the thing. And so I often talk about the hashtag not on our watch, which I see as the daily commitment I make to interrupt racism whenever and however I see it. So whether it's a guy telling a racist joke around the braai, a family member making an inappropriate comment at the dinner table, or someone writing or sharing a racist tweet online, then part of peacemaking is interrupting that moment and declaring, stop, that is not okay. So the hashtag not on our watch, a commitment to interrupt and to remove. So the negative action side of peacemaking would be doing the work of removing or dismantling the things that make it impossible for peace to be present. With violence towards women, that would maybe look like challenging someone on the street who whistles when a woman runs past, or when a mate makes an inappropriate comment to or about a woman, or to interject in a business meeting when a woman has been interrupted or ignored. Those are spaces where the negative action side of peacemaking is getting involved, is interrupting, is stopping the negative thing from continuing. I do, however, believe that it is the positive bringing of the peace into spaces and situations and conversations that will likely make the biggest difference and bring about the biggest changes. Although, like we said before, both and, this isn't either or. And so while interrupting racism is crucial, what am I doing in my own life and in the communities that I'm part of to see real change happen? Am I being intentional in moving into more diverse spaces, which will increase the likelihood of the friends I make becoming a more diverse group? Am I changing up the voices that inform me in terms of the books that I read, the podcasts I listen to, and even the shows and music that I watch and listen to? Things like that. And I spoke about that in another episode. Who are the people that inform me? And are they just other white people, or am I inviting a diversity of voice and thought and experience to inform my mind and my decision making? Positive steps I take to add peace or the hope of peace into my daily life. These are the things which take place at the same time as removing the things that threaten peace or take away peace. Now, when we talk about peace building, it might present itself in unusual or unexpected guises. And all the things I'm going to mention now are things that I'm either connected to or have been involved in recently. And so I think of the Makukanye Art Room in Khayelitsha, which was established in 2007 and run by Mandisi Sindo as a space for Black artists to venture into the so-called mainstream. Then, when the pandemic hit in 2020, it quickly transitioned itself into a food kitchen to provide meals for so many hungry kids. Peace building might look like the work done by the volunteers at Bottom Up, who work with learners from the greater Grassy Park area to help them think critically and to really question the system and structures around them in their community, in their schools, while reimagining how those spaces and schools might become more effective. Through reading, writing, and public speaking workshops, Bottom Up partners with these incredible young people in areas that many of us won't even go into, or many of us are scared to go into, or hear stories about, or raise our eyebrows when we hear about those areas. And Bottom Up works with these young people to interrogate and speak up against various relevant and often painful issues in their communities, such as racism, xenophobia, gender-based violence, school language, corporal punishment. Peace building might look like stepping into a program such as Partners for Possibility, which I was given huge privilege to be able to do this last year, who connect a business person with a principal typically from a low-resourced area on a journey of mutual growth, co-mentorship, and problem-solving. And so through this program, I was introduced to my friend Fuad Fulyun in the amazing Lavender Hill High School, set in a volatile community often only known for the types of stories we see on the news. Part of the peace building that I was able to offer into that space was taking my Heartline storytelling skills and resources and facilitating some story sharing spaces, as well as some values recognition and promotion. And the warmth and enthusiasm in which I've been welcomed into that space just goes to show that peace is not something that we can easily take into another space, but rather something we discover together in spaces where we allow our journeys and our stories to overlap. Peace building might look like a number of people creating voice notes of stories they read or told and sending it to help create a library of stories in a space where there were few books. This happened early on in the pandemic and lockdown. School with not many books, people from all over the country started voice noting stories for the school that nobody had been to, no one had visited. There was a call put out, and people said, let's build some peace, let's get involved. It might look like numerous people making short videos of themselves telling or making up stories or songs for a channel that a few of us started called Character Stories for Kids, which sprung up during a time of coronavirus when so many people were stuck at home. And so within weeks, we had tens of stories available, 70, 80, 100 stories available for parents of young children who had access to data and the internet, but to be able to find stories told in different languages, in different styles, to keep their kids happy and entertained. Peace building might look like sending data to someone who cannot afford it and yet feels so disconnected during times of lockdown, or visiting an old person who's very much cut off from the rest of the world. And even just as I record this episode, in the last week, in the last 3 days, peace building has happened through the Twitter app. In terms of a woman who was about to be thrown out on the streets, people came together and she was put up in a hostel and somebody's taking her into a home for a few days. We saw a soccer team get supplied with some training balls so that they can play. We saw a student whose fees have been covered by a number of people, each giving a small amount of money, which added up to pay the fees of one student. There is no blueprint for what peace building looks like, and excitingly also no limit as to how it might be invited. Although one likely ingredient of peace building is this idea of intentionality. Peace generally doesn't happen by accident. Another catalyst for peace would be compassion, empathy, and sometimes I think it's just as simple as showing up, putting up your hand, pitching up, saying, I'm here. Another catalyst for peace would be compassion, empathy. And sometimes I think it is as simple as just showing up. And the thing about peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building, peace facilitating, peace co-creating, whatever we're going to call it, is that the moment it starts happening, it is something that builds momentum. Because I read a story about people supporting this person doing this thing, I want to support a person doing this thing. When I see somebody who's about to be thrown into the street get helped and get put up and get clothed and looked after, I want to do that. When I see a community garden happening down the road, I want one of those behind my house. Peace is something in its shalom form, wholeness, completeness, togetherness, absence of the negative, presence of the positive that inspires other people around us. And so don't wait for peace. Start being a person of peace in your area, in your family, in your community, in your country, and see what might happen. Let's finish reading that quote once more. Peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. The act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and oppressors free. Peace can be like a river that is gentle and serene and has a calming effect on all who witness its presence. Peace can also be like a river that is rushing and raging and wearing down the force and obstacles of opposition in its path. But above all, peace can take two opposing forces that are pulling away from each other, and by refusing to let go or give up, slowly see those two things come closer together until finally they are one. Peace. can be a rivet. I hope you found that helpful and meaningful, and I hope as you move from the space, you will have conversations with people. You won't just leave this stuff in this podcast. Bring it up at the dinner table, chat to people, speak about these ideas of peace, encourage people, start something small and invite people to be part of it. And also, if you're someone that listens to my podcast, I want to invite you to subscribe, to share some feedback, to share this with other people. If you like these ideas, if you find them meaningful, let's get more people listening to them. So please tag your friends, share this, get it around. And until next week, let's be makers and bringers and keepers of peace and shalom. Peace like a river.